Daniel didn't notice the damage at first because it didn't arrive like a storm. It arrived quietly, disguised as responsibility, politeness, and maturity. He believed explaining himself was the right thing to do. He believed that if people understood his reasons, they would understand him. And if they understood him, they would stop doubting him. That belief followed him everywhere, into meetings, conversations, friendships, even moments when silence would have been enough. That afternoon at work felt ordinary on the surface. The office lights were too bright, the air slightly cold. Daniel stood near his desk, speaking carefully, choosing his words like fragile glass. He was explaining why the deadline slipped by 2 days, how the data came late, how he stayed up until 2 a.m. trying to fix what wasn't even his responsibility. He spoke calmly, respectfully, honestly. He thought honesty had weight. But as he spoke, something inside him slowly cracked. His manager's eyes weren't angry, but they weren't interested either. They drifted away for a second, then returned, empty. Daniel realized in that moment that the decision had already been made before he opened his mouth. His explanation wasn't being considered. It was being tolerated. When he finished speaking, there was a pause. Not the thoughtful kind. The uncomfortable kind. Then a short response came, polite but distant, followed by a reminder to be more careful next time. Daniel nodded. He always nodded. As he sat back down, his chest felt tight. Not because he was blamed, but because he felt invisible. He had offered his truth, and it hadn't mattered. That feeling followed him home. On the drive back, every red light gave his thoughts time to grow louder. He replayed the conversation again and again, wondering if he should have explained differently, spoken more confidently, added more details. He practiced imaginary versions of the same conversation, each one ending with him finally being understood. But deep down, another thought surfaced, one he tried to ignore. What if it was never about the explanation? At home, Daniel dropped his keys on the table and sat on the couch without turning on the lights. His phone buzzed with messages, someone questioning his decision to skip a gathering, another person asking why he hadn't replied sooner. He began typing explanations automatically. Long messages. Apologies. Context. Then he stopped. His thumbs hovered over the screen. His heart felt tired. Why did everything in his life require justification? He thought back to his childhood. Every choice had needed a reason. Every mistake required a defense. Silence was treated like guilt. If he didn't explain himself quickly, the story would be written by someone else. So he learned to speak fast, explain clearly, defend early. That habit had once helped him survive. Now it was suffocating him. Daniel realized he explained himself even when no one asked. He explained his ambition so people wouldn't think he was arrogant. He explained his exhaustion so people wouldn't think he was lazy. He explained his boundaries so people wouldn't think he was rude. He was constantly negotiating his worth. And the worst part was this: the more he explained, the more people expected him to. They questioned him more. They challenged him more. They treated his life like an open discussion, as if every decision required public approval. That night, lying in bed, Daniel stared at the ceiling, feeling something heavy settle in his chest. He had spent years trying to be understood, but all it had done was teach people that he doubted himself. He thought of people he admired, the calm ones, the grounded ones. They didn't rush to explain. They didn't overdefend. They spoke when it mattered and stayed silent when it didn't. And yet, they were respected. Daniel wondered when explaining had become his reflex instead of his choice. He wondered how many times he had given away his power without realizing it. As sleep finally pulled him under, one quiet truth stayed awake inside him: maybe the problem wasn't that people didn't understand him. Maybe the problem was that he believed everyone deserved an explanation. And somewhere in that realization, the first crack in the old habit appeared, small, almost invisible, but powerful enough to change everything that followed. The next few days passed slowly, but something inside Daniel had shifted. It wasn't confidence yet. It was awareness. A sharp, uncomfortable awareness that followed him into every interaction. He began noticing how quickly his mouth opened whenever someone questioned him, how his heart sped up at the slightest hint of doubt in another person's voice. Explaining himself had become muscle memory, not a decision. At work, a colleague asked why he had chosen a certain approach for a task. The question wasn't aggressive, just curious. Still, Daniel felt the familiar tension rise in his chest. He started to explain, listing reasons, background, effort. Halfway through, he caught himself. The colleague hadn't asked for a defense. He had asked a simple question. Daniel stopped, shortened his answer, and waited. Nothing bad happened. No argument. No judgment. The world didn't collapse. That small moment stayed with him longer than it should have. It felt strange, almost rebellious, to not fully explain himself. But beneath the discomfort was something new, relief. For the first time, he hadn't drained his energy trying to control someone else's understanding. Later that evening, Daniel met an old friend for coffee. As they talked, the friend casually questioned Daniel's recent choices, his slower pace, his refusal to chase promotions the way others did. In the past, Daniel would have launched into a long explanation, describing burnout, priorities, late nights, mental health. This time, the words stopped at his lips. "I'm comfortable with where I am," he said instead. The silence that followed was heavy. His friend raised an eyebrow, clearly expecting more. Daniel felt the urge to fill the gap, to soften the statement, to justify it. His hands tightened around the coffee cup. His heartbeat grew loud. But he stayed quiet. The friend shrugged and changed the topic. Daniel realized something important in that moment. People often push not because they need clarity, but because they want control. When he stopped feeding that need, the pressure disappeared. Not everyone reacted calmly. Some people seemed offended when Daniel didn't explain himself. They pressed harder, questioned his tone, accused him of being distant or changed. That hurt more than he expected. Part of him wanted to rush back to his old self, to reassure them that he was still the same, still kind, still considerate. But another part of him began to understand a painful truth. Those who benefited from his explanations felt threatened by his silence. At night, alone with his thoughts, Daniel felt waves of guilt. He worried that he was becoming cold, selfish, arrogant. Years of conditioning whispered that good people explain themselves, that kindness means clarity, that silence is rude. But then he asked himself a question he had never dared to ask before. Who taught me that? He realized that he had been confusing politeness with self-erasure. He wasn't obligated to carry everyone's comfort on his back. He wasn't responsible for how people interpreted his boundaries. Slowly, Daniel began practicing restraint. When questioned unnecessarily, he paused. When judged, he didn't argue. When misunderstood, he didn't rush to correct every assumption. At first, it felt like walking on a tightrope without a net. But over time, something unexpected happened. His words started carrying more weight. When he did speak, people listened more carefully. When he said no, it sounded final, not negotiable. His presence became calmer, steadier. He wasn't explaining his worth anymore, he was living it. One afternoon, his manager questioned a decision Daniel had made. The old fear rose instantly, but Daniel met it with stillness. He explained the choice briefly, clearly, without over-detailing or apology. Then he stopped talking. The room felt tense for a moment. Then his manager nodded and moved on. Daniel sat there, stunned. For the first time, he hadn't begged to be believed. He had trusted himself enough to stop speaking. Later, walking home, he felt lighter. Not proud in a loud way, but grounded. He realized how much energy he had wasted over the years trying to manage other people's perceptions. That energy was returning to him now, slowly, like a tide reversing direction. He began noticing how many people lived trapped in the same cycle he was leaving behind. Friends who apologized for their opinions. Colleagues who over-justified their decisions. Strangers who felt the need to explain their existence. Daniel understood them. He had been one of them. But he also understood something else now. Explanations don't create respect. Self-respect does. And every time he chose silence over justification, he was choosing himself. With time, Daniel's silence stopped feeling like an experiment and began to feel like a boundary. Not a wall meant to shut people out, but a line drawn gently, firmly, around his sense of self. He noticed how his body responded differently now. Conversations no longer left him drained. He slept more deeply. His thoughts felt clearer, less cluttered with imagined arguments and rehearsed defenses. Still, the habit didn't disappear completely. Some days, especially when he felt tired or uncertain, the old instinct returned. When someone raised an eyebrow or questioned his tone, his chest tightened, and words rushed forward, ready to prove, explain, defend. In those moments, Daniel reminded himself to breathe. To pause. To choose his response instead of surrendering to reflex. One evening, at a family gathering, the challenge came in its most familiar form. Relatives asked about his career, his plans, his future. Their questions were layered with expectations, comparisons, concern disguised as advice. For years, Daniel had answered these questions with long speeches meant to reassure everyone in the room. This time, he kept his responses simple. I'm working on something meaningful to me. That's enough for now. I'm happy with my direction. The room grew quieter with each answer. Some faces showed confusion, others discomfort. One relative laughed awkwardly and pressed him for details. Daniel felt the pressure rise, that old fear of being judged, of disappointing people who had known him his whole life. But he stayed calm. He realized that explaining himself had never truly satisfied them anyway. It had only delayed the judgment, never erased it. The difference now was that he wasn't carrying their disappointment as his burden. Later that night, alone in his room, Daniel felt a strange mix of sadness and peace. Letting go of the need to explain meant letting go of the fantasy that everyone would one day fully understand him. That fantasy had been comforting, but it was also a cage. Not being understood by everyone didn't mean he was wrong. It meant he was free. As weeks passed, Daniel's relationships began to change. Some grew quieter. A few faded. Others, unexpectedly, became deeper. The people who remained were those who listened without demanding constant justification, who accepted his choices even when they didn't fully understand them. He began to speak more honestly, without over-polishing his words. When he felt tired, he said so without apology. When he needed space, he took it without explanation. And when he made mistakes, he owned them briefly, without drowning in self-defense. This new way of living wasn't louder or more dramatic. It was subtle. But it changed everything. Daniel noticed how his confidence no longer depended on agreement. He could sit with disagreement without feeling threatened. He could be misunderstood without feeling erased. The world hadn't become kinder, but he had become stronger. One afternoon, a younger colleague approached him, visibly anxious, explaining a small mistake in great detail. Daniel listened, recognizing his former self in the rushed words and tense shoulders. When the explanation ended, Daniel simply nodded and said, "I understand." The relief on the colleague's face was immediate. In that moment, Daniel realized something powerful. People over-explain not because they are weak, but because they are afraid of losing acceptance. He had spent years trapped in that fear. Now, he saw it clearly. Acceptance that requires constant explanation is not acceptance at all. As he walked home that evening, the city noise felt distant. His steps were steady, unhurried. He thought about how much of his life had been shaped by other people's expectations, how often he had bent himself into shapes that felt unnatural just to avoid conflict. He wasn't angry about it anymore. He was grateful to have finally noticed. Daniel understood now that silence, when chosen consciously, was not avoidance. It was honesty. It said, "This is who I am, even if you don't agree." It said, "I trust myself enough to stop convincing you." And in that trust, he found a quiet power. The kind that doesn't argue. The kind that doesn't perform. The kind that stands firm without raising its voice. For the first time in his life, Daniel wasn't explaining his existence. He was living it. Daniel's life did not suddenly become perfect, but it became honest. That honesty was not always comfortable. There were moments when the absence of explanations created distance, and the distance hurt. Yet even that pain felt cleaner than the slow exhaustion he had lived with before. He was no longer bending himself into familiar shapes just to remain acceptable. He was standing still and letting the world respond however it chose. There were days when he questioned himself. On those days, silence felt heavy, almost arrogant. He wondered if he had misunderstood the lesson, if maybe he had swung too far in the opposite direction. He worried about becoming emotionally unavailable or dismissive. These doubts crept in quietly, especially when people reacted coldly or accused him of being different. But each time doubt appeared, Daniel looked at the evidence of his own life. He was calmer. His mind was no longer a battlefield of imagined conversations. His chest didn't tighten every time someone disagreed with him. Something deep inside him felt settled, as if a constant background noise had finally stopped. One night, he received a long message from someone he hadn't spoken to in years. The message was filled with accusations, misunderstandings, and assumptions about Daniel's intentions. In the past, he would have replied immediately, sentence after sentence, trying desperately to correct every false idea. He would have stayed awake, rereading his words, making sure nothing sounded wrong. This time, he read the message once. He felt the familiar urge to defend himself rise, but he let it pass. He asked himself a simple question: would explaining myself here bring peace, or would it reopen an old wound? He knew the answer. Daniel chose not to reply. The decision wasn't cruel. It was protective. For the first time, he understood that closure doesn't always come from being understood. Sometimes it comes from letting go of the need to be. As months went by, Daniel noticed a shift in how he carried himself. His movements were slower, more intentional. His voice, when he spoke, was steady. He no longer rushed to fill silence. He allowed pauses to exist without panic. That alone changed how people responded to him. Silence had a way of revealing truth. When Daniel stopped explaining, people revealed their intentions more clearly. Some lost interest. Some became kinder. Some grew uncomfortable, as if his calm exposed something they weren't ready to face. He learned that not every reaction required a response. This realization spilled into every area of his life. He stopped oversharing his plans before they were ready. He worked quietly, without announcing every step. He let results speak instead of promises. And when success came, he didn't explain how hard it had been unless someone truly wanted to know. There was freedom in that restraint. One afternoon, Daniel sat alone in a park, watching people pass by. He noticed how many faces carried the same tension he once did. People speaking quickly, apologizing unnecessarily, checking reactions mid-sentence. He wondered how much of the world's noise came from fear rather than truth. He realized something else too. Explaining yourself over and over is a form of self-doubt disguised as humility. True humility doesn't beg for understanding. It stands quietly, confident in its own intentions. Daniel thought about the times he had been misunderstood in the past. Those moments no longer haunted him. He understood now that being misunderstood is not a failure. It is a consequence of being real in a world that prefers comfort over honesty. Some nights, lying in bed, Daniel reflected on how far he had come. He didn't feel victorious. He felt grounded. Like someone who had finally returned home after years of wandering. He hadn't become louder or more dominant. He hadn't learned how to control people or manipulate outcomes. He had learned something far more valuable. He had learned how to stop abandoning himself. Every time he chose not to explain, not to justify, not to overdefend, he was choosing self-respect. And self-respect, he realized, was quiet. It didn't demand applause. It didn't need witnesses. It simply existed. And that existence was enough. Daniel knew there would always be people who didn't understand him, who questioned his choices, who filled the silence with their own assumptions. That was no longer his burden. He had spent enough years trying to be understood. Now, he was focused on being true. And in that truth, his life finally began to feel like his own. Daniel eventually stopped thinking of silence as something he was doing and began seeing it as something he was becoming. It wasn't a tactic anymore. It was a state of being. The constant inner dialogue that once demanded explanations for every move had softened, replaced by a steady awareness of his own intentions. He no longer needed to announce who he was. He knew. There were moments when life tested this new strength sharply. A project he had quietly worked on for months failed publicly. People talked. Questions came from every direction, some curious, some judgmental, some disguised as concern. The old version of Daniel would have gone into overdrive, explaining the risks, the lessons, the reasons it still mattered. He would have tried to control the narrative before it controlled him. This time, he acknowledged the failure simply. He didn't dramatize it or minimize it. He didn't defend himself against opinions that weren't asking for truth. He took responsibility where it belonged and moved forward without performance. The reaction surprised him. Some people lost interest immediately. Without explanations to consume, they had nothing to debate. Others respected him more deeply, sensing a maturity they couldn't quite name. Daniel understood then that explanations often feed noise, not clarity. When you stop feeding the noise, it fades. As time went on, Daniel noticed something subtle but powerful. He trusted himself faster. Decisions that once took days of mental back and forth now came with clarity. He no longer needed external validation to move forward. His confidence wasn't loud or showy. It was quiet, rooted, unshakable. He stopped rehearsing conversations that might never happen. He stopped writing messages in his head to people who had already left his life. The mental space that opened up felt unfamiliar at first, almost empty. Then it filled with something better, focus. With that focus, Daniel began building a life that felt aligned rather than impressive. He chose work that mattered to him, not work that required constant explanation. He surrounded himself with fewer people, but the connections were real. Conversations became slower, deeper. Silence was no longer awkward. It was shared. One evening, someone asked him a question that once would have sent him spiraling: "Don't you care what people think?" Daniel paused, not because he needed time to answer, but because the answer was honest and simple. "I care what I think," he said. The word surprised even him. He realized that most people who demand explanations are not looking for truth. They are looking for reassurance that their own choices are right, their own fears justified. Explaining yourself too much invites others to sit in judgment over a life that isn't theirs. Daniel no longer offered that seat. There were losses along the way. Some relationships didn't survive his boundaries. Some people accused him of changing, of becoming distant, of losing warmth. Those accusations hurt, but they didn't break him. He understood now that being constantly accessible is not the same as being kind. Kindness without boundaries is self-betrayal. One quiet morning, Daniel sat by the window, watching the light move slowly across the room. He thought about how much of his life he had spent proving things, to parents, to bosses, to friends, to strangers. He had believed that explanations were bridges. Now he saw that many of them had been chains. Letting go of the need to be understood didn't make him careless. It made him intentional. He chose when to speak, when to clarify, when to explain. The difference was choice. Silence was no longer forced on him by fear. It was chosen by strength. Daniel knew he would still explain himself sometimes. To people he loved. In moments that required clarity. When understanding truly mattered. The lesson was never about never explaining. It was about not explaining yourself to everyone. Not every opinion deserves your energy. Not every question deserves an answer. Not every misunderstanding needs correction. The world will always have something to say. The moment you stop trying to manage all of it, you reclaim your life. Daniel stood up, feeling the calm certainty settle in his chest. He wasn't chasing peace anymore. He was living inside it. And that was the change that stayed.